and teachers were asked whether they agreed with this or not. And 50% of the teachers in the arts-barren schools said that. And only 30% of the teachers in the arts-rich schools said that. I don't know what would happen. Yeah. Excuse me, I'm just going home. And so why did these things happen? I just want to review the thinking that's accrued over the years for me and others. So arts and community. I've talked about things about arts and community and understanding yourself and getting along with others and collaborating. And in collaboration, taking advantage of other kids' expertise. You have a project that you're all working on, you bring different skills, you learn that other kids have skills, that you don't have to impose your total design on the project, and you can do things at a better level because of that. Arts and peer groups, it's, you know, as a parent, I would say I'd much rather have my child involved in one or more of, and intensively in art practice and education in school, in part because I think highly of the other kids involved in art in school, and think it's important to me for what kids are maybe not involved in. What are they doing? What are they displacing in their lives by being in art? Well, maybe they're saving themselves from some more socially destructive practices, I don't know. Art and self-efficacy. Anytime you gain skills, you gain sense of efficacy, and that's important. Some kids we've seen in classrooms, particularly fairly new immigrants, don't have any way of demonstrating that they have skills in classrooms. They get involved in art and suddenly teachers say, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Their friends say, I didn't know you could do that. And they start talking, or they start interacting. I've talked about drama as a curriculum for learning things. There are some things about art and cognitive development, a particular stream of work that I'm going to go into in a second, ways of thinking and being in the world, and so forth. But I get a question. I'm sure one of you is going, wait a minute, is it art? Is it art that does this? And could basketball do the same sort of thing? And so I took the chance while I was doing this work to write probably the longest chapter in the book, which is the analysis of whether sports does the same thing. And I've tried that in a variety of ways. And, you know, I approach it with the notion, you know, sports is not going to work out here. It's not going to work out like arts, and I'm going to get beat up by the coach. And, so I did whatever I could to break the data and make it come out in a way that I'd be safe. But honestly, approaching it the right way, you discover that sports are important in some of the same ways in terms of engagement and community. Not as important as boosting academic fortunes, but more kids do actually graduate from high school if they're involved in sports. They do better than kids not involved in sports in college. So it is a positive read. It's not as positive, it's positive in different ways from art, but it's there and it's important. And my conclusion has been the one I mentioned earlier when I got up on the stage, which is both of these things, and many others in high school, allow kids to engage their passions. So the kids coming to high school because they're so involved in basketball or ice hockey or curling, you're not going to send them over to the art room and have them be happy. Some of them, yes, but not many. And you're not going to take the kids in the painting class or the drama class and send them off to the basketball team. In a way, at that point in their lives, they're two different kinds of kids, and they want different things. And if a high school's not bringing things to these kids, it's not doing its job. And so I think that was important. Okay, so choice of passions. Okay, I'm going to say a few things about new developments based on this work. And this is looked from the book in which I talk about pro-social behavior. I began thinking about a year ago that this has to be involved in empathy. empathic behavior. It has to be involved in caring about, understanding the needs of others. And if you care and understand the needs of other people, chances are you might go out and volunteer on their behalf, whether it's kids or seniors or whatever the needs are that you see. And so I began talking about that with my colleagues, and what do we know about empathy? Well, empathy, it hadn't been anything like a specialty of mine in my research. Behaviorally, empathy has been studied a lot by cognitive psychologists, and its importance is well recognized, or what it is recognized. It's understanding a situation that someone else is in, that's a cognitive sort of thing. It's feeling the situation that someone else is in, that's an affective process. It's not getting completely wrapped up in the idea that your feelings are that person's feelings. You can keep that, you can distinguish between that self and you. And then it involves some inclination to help. So an empathic person generally, okay, well, I want to help, whether you do or not, but you've got the inclination to help. That was well understood. And then my reasoning was, what goes on in the brain with empathic processes? What do we know about that? And I was leading up to a question that I wanted to investigate, and that was, if certain things go on in the brain when you engage in empathic behavior, or if your neural circuits are wired a certain way when you have a tendency to be empathic, could art, in any of its forms, have any connection to that? So my question became, what's the relationship between the neuroscience of empathy and the neuroscience of art? And the way that plays out is there are a lot of studies in the neuroscience of empathy. And there aren't many, but it's growing really fast in the neuroscience of art. The neuroscience of art are studies mainly in music, movement, visual art, some in dance. I didn't find one in theater, which was too bad, because theater is such a laboratory for empathy. But it's just how hard to act out a scene in an MRI scanner, I guess. So I've just finished an article, and if any of you write me, I'm happy to send you a copy of it for the Journal of Neuroscience. So it's called The Neuroscience of Art and Human Empathy, Behavioral and Brain Imaging Evidence. And so my contention is one that I just described. And what I found was that, in fact, the neuroactivations in empathic behavior overlap a lot with neuroactivations in art. And the neuroactivations in art were based on things like judging paintings as attractive or beautiful or not, so it was a whole aesthetic thing. It was listening to music and imagining or envisioning. It was looking at figures painted in visual art and understanding things about the goals, intentions. What can you read in this figure about what's going on in the scene in a painting? Those kinds of things. And ultimately, when I had gotten through that and said, well, I'm going to show you the overlapping areas in a second, I just took a quick tour through the neuroscience of reading, learning reading, and the neuroscience of mathematics, and there was practically no overlap at all between those and the cultivation of empathy. So a nice sort of little argument began to develop as I put this together, that it might be important to pay attention to art when we think about empathic kids or empathic adults. There you go. It turns out that empathy and arts in the upper left here are connected to the prefrontal cortex in the brain. Prefrontal cortex is, oh, it's the best. What can I say? The prefrontal cortex is an executive. It allows things to happen. It inhibits things happening. And these functions translate to a very important role into how we understand things. And the prefrontal cortex is always involved in empathic behavior. The third one down on the left side is pointing to an interior part of the brain, the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is very big on sensing pain, smaller extent sensing pleasure. These three, and then one other area at the top pointing down to essentially shouldn't go past that dotted line, which is the division between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. There's a junction right between those two lobes that lights up whenever anybody's being empathic. And it does not light up for anything else. It's very, very peculiar. And it's very bright in MRI films. Okay, and the arts are involved with all of these things. And then you look in contrast at math, which is largely processed in the central temporal lobe and the central parietal lobe. Reading over in the lower right with the occipital lobe, they don't overlap. Now, this is not a technical, neuroscientists who go after this stuff will plot actual coordinates from studies, imaging studies, in high detail and look at correlates. But at a gross level, these are just not going to correlate. I don't care if you can pinpoint correlates for any of these central spots. They're not going to overlap at all. So it's a robust sort of thing. That's what my colleagues tell me, which is, I think, is pretty cool. So I think this is, assuming this piece and this type of thinking settles down reasonably well as a good overview of what's going on with neuroscience and art, I'd like to do the same sort of thing with neuroscience and creativity, because there are, based on the little I know, handful of studies, there are some possibilities of similar overlaps between art and creativity. Now, I'll just give you one hint of that. The prefrontal cortex is very important in creativity because it lets down its guard when you think of things and allows the brain to process anything that comes into it without hesitation, without pausing to scrutinize or to evaluate the information. And in a sense, you can see that creative processes require a great deal of simply a flow of information and connection building that's spontaneous to allow a creative product. The prefrontal cortex does that. The prefrontal cortex also lets down its guard in situations of autism. It doesn't give an autistic child enough time to process and think about information without beginning to process it in the core of the brain. It's very important in that process. It also is essentially a gate that stays open that allows Asperger's kids to say things without thinking about them. Just simply let them out. So like I said, the prefrontal cortex is just an amazing piece of regulatory power on the brain, and it's very, very important. And so the point I lead up to with this work is it's related to the idea that the brain will grow and get better at doing the things it gets better at. So people who are more empathic, perhaps inspired by their experiences in art, will become more empathic because they are exercising those brain regions, those neural circuits, and so forth, and they get better at it. If you don't act empathically, you will continue to lose any empathic behavior over time because you're not doing those things. That's called neuroplasticity. The brain grows, and it grows in areas where you use it, and it shrinks in areas where you lose it. So that leads me to this, which got it. This is the graduate updated to 2011. I mean, plastics is over, right? That's oil. And a couple of them. How's my time going? Anybody who cares? Okay.